Hello. A lot of people here, help me. We say that we should contribute more, for example, with presentations, with academies, lightning talks, etc. We should have the balls to get up and do stuff like this more. Well, I've never given a lightning talk before, so I thought, what the fuck? It's my turn to do this. I didn't know what to talk about, so I asked someone, and the reply I got was, Mick, you should talk about open source. So for the next 9 minutes, that's what you're going to hear. More precisely, I want to try and convince you that you're all open source developers, you just don't know it. My participation with open source started properly in 2000. At the time I was working for a company that wrote an AutoCAD type program. It was a code base that was started in the 70s, and it had a GUI which was in desperate need of a facelift. Not now and not then do I believe that you should write code from scratch. In Australia we have a style of rugby called Aussie rules. Now if you've ever watched it, you see that the players jump up on each other's back to get up high to get to the ball first. Just like that, I'm interested in looking at whose back I can climb up on to get a head start. Some people will see existing code as a challenge. I'd rather think of existing code as an asset and an advantage. At that time when I looked around, for something to use, this AutoCAD type program after all had over 5,000 dialogues and wizards and screens in it. And just fresh out of university I knew that Java and Swing wasn't going to cut it. What I found at that time was NetBeans, which had just been open sourced out of the Czech Republic. Even very early on, NetBeans had a very clean architecture to it, where all of the GUI and the configuration to it was separate to the IDE functionality. So it was quite easy to step in, tear those code bases apart, and use just the GUI code for the AutoCAD program. That was an initiative that led to what's today known as the NetBeans platform. Years later, when Eclipse started, they followed suit. It was also an initiative which got me elected by popular vote to the government's board. Enough bragging. That's really not the point of the anecdote. The point is that if you're passionate about code, not just the code you write, but about other people's code, open source isn't a pet project. It's not something on the side. It's an intrinsic part of your craft. But I think that passion is only half the story. It's also about responsibility. You've probably heard me rant on about how much I mislike the idea of code ownership. The idea that we belong in organisational silos, or that code needs protecting, or dedicated programmers on it, has to be an idea which is decades out of date. Well, there's something which I mislike more than that, and that is when I see developers quietly hack around the faults that they see in open source code, rather than filing a bug report, or creating a simple test case to reproduce it reliably so someone else can fix it easily, or just making a simple attempt at trying to fix it yourself. It's not the lack of collaboration that bugs me, but the lack of responsibility. I think we came from an enterprise development environment where a lot of our products were proprietary. And with them we had support and guarantees and a high standard of quality, and someone to blame if things went wrong. And I wonder, as we've shifted over to predominantly use open source tools and libraries, will we still have remnants of that attitude? After all, open source is not a free lunch. There is no one to blame. There is no support unless you're paying another company for that. And there's no guarantee. When you use open source, you're taking a bunch of code written from a bunch of volunteers and assuming full responsibility for it yourself. So when you find a fault in that open source code, you're in fact identifying technical debt that you are responsible for. And when you hack around that fault, all you're doing is doubling your technical debt. You're left with two places in the code which are at risk of change. To play devil's advocate, one can say that taking this attitude means exploding the lines of code that you're responsible for. For example, your developers can get bogged down in doing low-level improvements in all the open source code. There's a healthy amount of truth in that. It's missing the point. No matter what, every code layer deserves a lean and result-oriented attitude. And the technical debt isn't about the total number of lines of code, it's about the total entropy in the code. At the end of the day, if you find a bug, you should still fix it properly. So, the boundary that you think exists between your company's code and the open source code that is built upon need not be real. Your company is already paying you to maintain a sustainable relationship to your technical debt for the code that you are responsible for. Is it only your engagement and your ability to communicate across the groups and the mediums which is holding you back from being a better open source developer? That was it.